Oh, we're live. Live in effect. EFFECT.
Mhm.
Smooth operator operating correctly. But you already know we got the black a background, so you already know shit's different. It's a new wave. It's something new, something fun, something's popping. And you also see I have a guest here, Jon Ivan Gill. Man, the homies who got PhDs always front on me. They don't like to put the doctor up. They rather put the rap name and shit. Like that's what's up. So we have Doctor Jon Ivan Gill, Gilead Seven, who's coming in with the hot with the MC name. What's going on, John?
I'm good. I'm good. Peace, brother. Good to be with here. Good to be here building with you, man. Definitely a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. We connected through a mutual friend. Jonathan Calvillo was on this Mestizo video series. We talked about Latinos and hip hop and religion. It was a really fun conversation and looking at it through a sociological perspective. But he put me up on some of the work that you were doing that had me really intrigued around hip hop and religion and philosophy. And I was like, yo, I got to learn more about what you're up to. And before we even, so I reached out to you, and before we even got into, your work, you told me, yo, I'm in Tijuana right now, bro. I was like, yo, what part of LA you in? Or like, he's like, I'm in Tijuana right now, bro. I was like, what the? Tell me about why you're in Tijuana right now, John.
Yeah, you know what? It's peaceful here. I love it. I was teaching in San Diego at one time, and I moved here when I was teaching there. I'm not teaching there now, but at that time I was here, and I just loved the environment. I was really at peace here. Um, I'm not too far from the ocean. Life is beautiful for me here. So after that period of me teaching in San Diego ended, I don't want to really move. It reminds me a lot of Belize. My father is from Belize, and his family's from Belize and Honduras. In my estimation of the world, it's very similar to that. So it's like home for me. It's a home away from home. So yeah, I been here and been loving it.
What impression of Tijuana did you have before getting there? Kind of maybe even through pop culture or whatever media. And then what did you find once you got there?
That's an interesting question because I think there's a certain conception of Tijuana that comes out in media that's, oh, this is the place you don't want to go. But I'm not a person who usually listens to much unless I observe it for myself. So I mean, the perception of what the media says and what I've personally experienced here is very different. Very, very,
Yeah,
very, very different.
growing
I've
up in Southern California, I know you grew up in Chicago, John. I grew up in Southern California, and in our mind, even as a Mexican American youth, and even just kind of growing up young and male in Southern California, Tijuana was the place where you can quote unquote unloosen the belt. You know what I'm saying? You could go get drunk. You could go prostitution. There were no rules. It was, and then people extrapolated that notion onto the rest of the country, and then so this weird like so Tijuana kind of served as like a weird stand-in for what it meant to be a Mexican city, what it meant to be from a Mexican city, like what it meant to be like Mexico as lawless and criminal and seedy. And so then when I so I went down there as a late teen, and like, oh, like reveled and all that. Oh, because the military base is right there too. I mean, military. So there's a lot going on there.
That's
That
right.
culture is dynamic.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, it's a border city, and border cities, as Anzaldúa tells us, are very interesting places where so many things merge. So yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
No, it's dope. My wife's family is from Rosarito, right there.
Oh,
So and
down
then
the
I
street.
spent like 6 months backpacking through Mexico, and I don't speak Spanish. Your Spanish is probably better than mine. Um, but I got to know kind of different parts of the country and just like opened my eyes to the diversity of cultures within a country. That was kind of
That's right.
dope.
That's right.
So
That's right.
all that to say, Mexico for the win. All right, uh, Doctor Gill, I did my Googles, bro, and when I do my Googles, sometimes the internet turns up some fun, and let's see what happened. Let's see, where am I at here?
The good old internet. Like,
Let's see, we're gonna do this. and then we're going to share it. And then we're going to see what that looks like. I came across your website, where I think you call yourself a religious connoisseur. Booyaka.
Yeah.
What is a religious
Yes.
connoisseur?
A religious connoisseur for me is something I think I've been, because I grew up charismatic Pentecostal. And this is something that I have been since that time. I wasn't supposed to be. But what I mean by that is someone who appreciates understanding different religions. As simple as that. You know, someone who is very interested in different ways of looking at the world and goes so far as to collect them of source into their own understanding of the world. Not that I own any of them, but because I don't own anything, but it in the sense that I find it very important to understand things about different religions the way some people might understand different things about records, and I do records as well. So I was always that sort of individual to the point that when I was reading the Book of Mormon, my father was like, you know, that's contradictory. And then when I was going to the Woodson Library on the south side of Chicago and reading about everything from the occult to like UFO stuff, and people were like, why are you reading that? But I was a connoisseur. And I think being a connoisseur of religion is very important in understanding that perspective varies as the wind, and it allows us to get into the mindset of thinking about why one perspective would be valued over another, and to kind of question, well, is there this sort of tension between religions that we've been told exist? You know, this contradiction, where does that come from? Does it come from the traditions themselves, or is that something that we've socially constructed? So different perspectives and people saying different things from different ways, I think, allows us to kind of reconceptualize what it means to exist in the world. And religion is a way in which people exist in the world. So I think that's an important way to approach the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of on my path to enlightenment, I hesitate to use the term woke, but I had a, and not for any good reason. I'm happy to use it as well. But that said, had a choice, and I think a lot of young men of color coming up in hip hop had a choice early on in the '90s as to how they were going to view religion, because there was a really strident note that religion was part of an oppressive system, and especially a certain form of religion, a white man religion and a colonizer's religion. And if you're listening closely to the certain type of hip hop, you were getting those messages. And if you're reading, you read in college or whatever, you're kind of getting some other signals that maybe religion isn't the type of thing I should be all that interested in understanding and propagating. But
Hmm.
you thought that it, like religion, and as did I, had some value. What do you think made you choose that road rather than say religion is poison, it's going to hurt us, it's going to hamper us, it's going to harm us, let's get rid of it as soon as possible?
Yeah, yeah. You know what? That's a good question. And I think for me, hip hop was the reason why I continued, because I was on that path before I even really got into hip hop seriously. But as I got into hip hop more, I think that was really a path I saw in hip hop. Because okay, if you look at the Zulu Nation's foundations, you know, a lot of those come from Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism. I remember, and this was a shift for me, bro. Killer Priest album, the first Killer Priest album, Heavy Mental, and I was a charismatic Pentecostal when I encountered this work. But here you have a brother who's telling us a Hebrew Israelite theology that he's reading from the same Hebrew Bible I grew up reading, but he's doing something different. He's not throwing it away. And even a line when he critiques other members of the Wu-Tang Clan, who some of them were atheists and 5%ers. He said, half of my crew is atheists, the other half is waiting on a spaceship. I can't take this. So I saw something in his approach, and I said, you know what? Religion itself, and then I went into a whole stint of studying Hebrew Israelite theology. I used to go to their meetings and stuff like that in Chicago, um, where it was a strong community of Hebrews that still exists now. Some of the brothers I knew actually moved to Israel and they live there now. But
Mm.
there's a strong community of Hebrews, so I would
Is
chill
that
with
Brother
them.
Polite? Is that like, is Brother Polite? No, Brother Polite. What's his angle? Sorry,
I
are you familiar with him?
Yeah, I know Brother Polite. I'm not sure. I
Okay.
don't know if he's a Hebrew Israelite. I'm not sure. But
Okay.
but
Sorry. Yeah.
but
No.
but but, but I know you talk. But I know he talks about those are theologies. There
Right.
is there is a brother who is, and I'm actually forgetting his name now. He's actually an MC, and if I said his name, you'd know him.
But
But
this is all like a testament to the fact that, on the one hand, hip hop wasn't explicitly Christian or anything that like would resemble like gospel at its core. But on the other hand, if you're looking for religious messages, because the people making the music in a lot of cases come out of religious context, you're going to find allusions to the Hebrew scriptures and like and even the New Testament. And so yeah, so I did. I took comfort early on as I said, okay, I'm gonna try to wed my interest in hip hop and my interest in Christianity, and try to find these signals in dope hip hop that wasn't necessarily Christian that I can kind of hang on to and make sense of and maybe try to pattern after. So for me, early on, the Five Percenters' expression of their faith in hip hop was a model for what kind of shit that I could talk about my Christianity.
there you go. Right, right. Because you don't have to negate, and I think even on this line, bro, we got to bring in tunnel rats because and I always say that, well, so-called Christian hip hop is pre-tunnel rats, post-tunnel rats, because you
Mm,
have a group of people in this crew who just didn't give a fuck. They like, look, we're evangelicals, but we'll still beat your ass in a battle. Don't get it
right.
twisted. And so there was no relinquishing of one for the other, and that was something I thought too was very powerful because when people were saying, okay, well, if you're a Christian, and this is even someone I was in the church,
Yep.
people were saying, well, as a Christian, you can't battle. They're saying no, no.
Mm,
I think a rapper not to battle was like telling a striker on a soccer team not to score a goal. It's the exact
right.
same thing. You wouldn't do that, so why would you do this? And so those were stepping stones. I always looked
Huh.
at them as models. So I mean, peace in them, especially Journey Big, to me, one of the dopest MCs ever.
Yeah, I'll co-sign that. Well, I wonder how much their kind of dual identity as, this both because they're Mexican American. They grew up right here in the San Gabriel Valley. Their dad went to Viet, or at least
Their dad went to
Dax's dad
Vietnam.
comes out of
That's right.
Vietnam. Like
That's
all
right.
that's informed, like this neighborhood shit. Like it's all comes doesn't fall out of the sky. It all comes up from our surroundings or whatever. So
That's right.
yeah, no, it's really interesting. So, what got you interested in the intersection of religion and hip hop?
Yeah. When I first started taking hip hop seriously, it I was into a lot of Wu-Tang. I was into a lot of, I mean, KRS, Juggernauts. The list goes on. And as you mentioned earlier, these are people who always discussed religion, ideas that we commonly refer to as religion. They would come up in the songs, whether they were being praised or critiqued. And there was something powerful about people who saw hip hop from graffiti to shout out to Giants Casting Saddles, GCS, the shirt I'm wearing. This is one under their new shirt. So when you're in Santana, make sure you check out the family. Peace to Hector and them and everybody. Peace to George. Peace to everybody. But there's something about people who lived the culture of hip hop as a way through which they made sense of the world. And when I got into the underground scene in Chicago, that's what it was. It was people who basically lived, breathed, died the shit, And I had to realize that I was doing the same thing. but I didn't realize it for a long time. But there was a reason, and shout out to my uncle who I grew up in his church. There was a reason why I was writing rhymes during the sermon, because I wasn't getting meaning from that. I was getting meaning from this culture of hip hop. This underground culture of hip hop that I was engaged in. And I, staying up like till 3, 4 in the morning, listening to JP Chill. One of actually when Common says HBK was the only station to ever fuck with rap, he's talking about the DJ JP Chill who used to play records on WHBK, University of Chicago's radio station. So I would stay up late at night and listen to that. And I have to go to church in the morning. And my dad like, you can stay up as long as you want, as long as you get up in the morning. I don't care. So I'd be groggy, but I would know, man, I got this tape of like 3 hours of like the dopest hip hop that's out right now. Like all a bunch of indie shit is just so I was getting meaning from that. And as I was getting into the culture, I was challenging what I knew about the world and what I was told about the world. So as I began to really develop it, I said, well, if we look at religion from the root religare. I was just in a class on Maya religion last night that was taught by Eats Papalo, a good friend of mine, and Unbat's Men, the author of this text, he brings up this word religare, which is this which it can't be translated to the modern definition of religion. It really just means to bind, but in cultures before ours and in periods before ours, the word was used to refer to culture, refer to what mattered most in a society. So religare was everything from astrology to sex. And it wasn't just this whole transcendent notion of what it means to adhere to a god or gods that you can't really see or you don't have evidence of in the physical world. So hip hop was dealing with the physical world, and not just the physical world because it gives possibilities for more, but it was dealing with, okay, well, as a person with roots in the continent we now know as Africa, I live my life and society sees me in a certain way. This is what I go through because I'm seen as such. This is what hip hop was telling me. I wasn't getting that in my church. I wasn't getting in my church. Well, there's injustice all around the world and here's how we fuel it. But I was getting that in hip hop. So if hip hop is like this definition of religare, which is this whole notion of binding us to the world itself, I said, well, that's what hip hop's doing. And I had to realize that yeah, I'm still going to church, but that's not where I'm getting meaning from. If that makes some sense.
Absolutely. So you were practicing hip hop as much as you were practicing your faith within a church context, or at least early on. I wonder, did you see those two things as separate? And then has your work since then been, it sounds like, kind of bringing those kind of two notions together?
Yeah,
So,
because see, right. Because see, I honestly, I never really did see them as separate. I was told they were. And I was told that, well, no, you got to separate this from that. I even had one of my friends, one of my earlier, because I probably left my uncle's church in like probably my first year of college, and I would bounce back and forth from time to time. But then I know I went to visit one day, and I had a tape of some stuff I did. It was just like some battle rap shit. And then one of my friends was like, I heard she heard it. She's like, this is good, but you're not talking about Jesus on there. And my response was, do I have to?
right.
Is yeah. So and actually, Journey said a line like that. He said, GC said, just because you grew up in the church don't qualify you for the mic session. I said it, And then he had another line. He said, well, you thinking they ill because they say Jesus when they freak. But so I was like, well, even if I have this belief, I don't have to say it
Right.
to have it. So I never saw them as separate, but I was told that, okay, well, there's a sacred and there's a secular, like Doc Daniel White Hodge, prolific scholar in hip hop. He talks about this all the time. He actually has a program called Profane Faith, where he explores this notion of the distinction between the sacred, secular, and profane, asking, well, are these really distinctions?
Sure. And so you begin to kind of examine and question these categories. What role did philosophy play in kind of informing how you went about analyzing and dissecting what you were experiencing?
Hmm. No, that's a great question because that's a huge part of it. Like, I became interested in philosophy in maybe like earlier than I can remember because I was always curious about questions about well how things are the way they are, and then um, in a more I guess what some may call a more traditional sense, I kind of stumbled on my mother's Plato books because she wasn't a philosophy major, but she had some of those classes when she was in college. She taught elementary education, focusing on children with special needs, and she did that for a long time. But she studied philosophy. She actually had some theology books around the house too, like Paul. She had Paul Tillich's The Religious Situations. But in terms of like philosophy, what people might understand to be, well, I see philosophy as everything, but what some people may kind of call it, I started reading her books, and then my father, he got this encyclopedia set, this Britannica set, and at that time it came with these things, the great books, and I mean, and the great books had like 54 editions, which focused on philosophy in the Western world, whatever that means. Jennifer Vest, she challenges that notion. I think we should read her work, The Promise of Caribbean Philosophy. But for what it is, what people call Western philosophy, we had all that stuff there, and I mean, everything from Hegel to Socrates to Kant to, I mean, the list goes on. There's an Aquinas section that comes with that. So I would kind of flip through all that. Like I didn't really know what I was doing at that time, I don't think, but I was curious. Then I began to take philosophy classes in undergrad, and even at an evangelical undergrad, which is where I was. I went to Judson College. Now it's Judson University. Um, I had a professor, Brad Seaman, and he basically was like, "Look, I understand that we're in an evangelical context, but I'm gonna have y'all read everything. And if your faith is strong enough, he said your faith should be strong enough to deal with this. You know, mine was not, but if that's where I really seriously encountered Nietzsche. Seriously looked at everything from Occam to Derrida to a lot of people we kind of encountered in his class, and yeah, he was honest about it, and he just said, "Well, where does this leave you?" And yeah, but so it started there. Then it really developed into when I got into graduate school, being confronted with the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, which kind of was an accident because there was a course at Chicago Theological Seminary, which is across the street from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Well, at the time, it was across the street from the University. Classic, very, very amazing institution, amazing thinkers. My friend Jose Francisco Morales is there right now, also known as DJ Ramalogic. Shout to him because he actually encouraged me to study philosophy and theology. But I took a course there, and the course was called Process Theism. Now I didn't know what the fuck it was. I thought it was just okay. Well, is this how you process your theism? And I just jumped in, and I didn't know. But when I got in, the class was revolving around a system of thought called process philosophy and process theology, which develops from process philosophy, kind of associated with the work of Alfred North Whitehead, Charles Hartshorne, and other people. And that's when I really began to engage philosophy more, engage what people call philosophy more. But yeah, so process is very influential on what I write, you know.
So how to sketch kind of the basic tenets of a process view and how that informs, because you've already alluded to it a couple of times, how that informs what you do when you start your definition making. So what counts as philosophy? Like earlier on, you suggested philosophy is everything, and I suspect your view of religion is similarly open. So let's begin to unpack how you get there, because we're going to get to your book where which is pretty fascinating and amazing. I'll just pull up the name of it now. Underground Rap as Religion: A Theopoetic Examination of Process Aesthetic Religion. So you make a claim in the book that underground rap functions as a religion. So some of this comes out. Well, this comes out of your POV, and so go ahead and sketch kind of what gets us to such an open view of what counts as philosophy and religion.
Yeah, yeah. This is where it gets fun. This is where it really gets fun. Um,
I might have to ask you to go slow, bro, if I have some questions.
but no, for sure. Because look, I'm gonna be real. When I got in that class, I didn't know what was going. I just knew I liked it. And then I
Yep,
took a
yep.
course with my advisor, Dr. Monica Coleman, who was at Claremont School of Theology and Claremont Graduate University. One of the reasons why I came to California. Claremont is known as a center of process thinking, and that revolved around CGU, Graduate University, and then Claremont School of Theology. Which, yeah, but no, when I first got, I didn't know what was going on, but I just knew it was dope. And so like the main tenet of process thought, I would say, is that the world is an organism, meaning that, well, things we thought of, things we thought of to exist as things in themselves, as maybe Kant might talk about, and in Leibniz kind of understanding of monads, things which sort of exist on their own. For Whitehead, that wasn't a practical way to look at the world, because for him, everything from what we know about science, history, things we know about religion, etc., they make us question that. So the basic tenet of process thought, I would say, and I guess depend on who you ask, it may be different. But for me, the basic tenet is, well, there there are no such things as things, because everything is in process. So it causes us to rethink about stuff, because what does it mean to call a table when it's always in motion? Um, because if I come back 10 years from now, there are molecular things happening in the table that may cause it to disintegrate. But that's happening right now. I just can't see it because I have a microscope. But if we look at the world as always in process and things always becoming, things aren't anything, if in the sense of a stagnant identity, which would be metaphysically, scientifically impossible. That's the first tenet. So Whitehead really wasn't doing.
Let's stop there. That's dope.
Sorry.
I think that was really clear. There aren't fixed, discrete things in the world that we could point out and say, let's mark that X, and there's another thing over here, we're going to mark that Y, and those are two distinct things with distinct properties. Because you start, what are the properties of X? What are the properties of Y? And you start getting into describing a thing as if you can account for all the properties. But we know we can't account for all those properties. And even more, we know. So you said it's a kind of a double-barreled blast at a particular view of the world. You said it's like metaphysically it doesn't make sense, and physically it doesn't make sense. So we know, like, physically it's clear. Well, maybe I don't know. I don't know the science that well, but like the further down we get, the more kind of interconnected everything is, and
That's right.
there is no substratum that is a thing. You know what I'm saying? It's just everything's moving, and we don't even know how it's moving or where it's moving. So
That's right.
that's on the physical. Now, what's the metaphysical argument for a process view of the world, and then
Right. Which that's the even more fun part. Like, it's because as you said, and you're very right, we can observe in the physical world process, but many may argue that, well, there is a certain structure that the world adheres to, and that structure is in some sense fixed. Um, and yeah, well, there's certain things, because that even goes back to certain strands of Hegelianism, Platonic thought, systems of thought that we find in Egypt and Mexico, etc. There. But I think that we have challenges with that, in the sense that we metaphysically, which just simply means how the way in which the world works, the metaphysics of the world is how this thing that we call the universe functions. The question would be, well, do we know? Do we know that there is a structure to the universe that is beyond process? We have certain laws of physics we think are pretty sure, but how do we know that when I throw this flash drive up in the air, that is going to come down until I do it? What if there's a time when that doesn't happen? And what if these notions of structure that we talk about the world and are simply things that we come up with? Um,
Sure.
and and so the process version of that would say that yes, they're what Whitehead might call stubborn fact. There are some things that seem to be the case, um, and from experience that seems to be the case. But does that necessarily mean that the universe has a fixed structure? So is the universe itself in pride? Because as we know, even physically, well, if the conditions of the physical world change, then the conditions of the metaphysical world change, because then the what we call laws that govern that are going to change. So it's almost like, some might say gravity is 10 meters per second squared universally. That's not true, because there's some places where it's a bit more, you know, or a bit
Sure.
less. So if so if that's not fixed, what else is not? And then that goes into
Sure.
metaphysical arguments about God and about things like that. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, like physical facts, there's a bunch of physical facts about the universe that are contingent, and we can grant that. But there are So, like I'm really interested. So, Claremont, big ups Claremont School of Theology. Big up CGU. I have a close connection to those institutions. Um, and I'm interested in learning more about process theology because I'm interested in how a notion that I first saw you introduce that got me really thinking, and that is this distinction between theology versus theopoetics. So first, I guess we understand theology if we just break out the word, the God logic or the God reasoning or something. So if I were just to look at theology, it'd be reasoning around God or something like that. Theopoetics is like, oh shit, what is that? So first, how would you draw those distinctions? The
Right, all
distinction
right.
between the two.
Right. No. That's great. That's great. So, theology, as you just pointed out, some would say is God talk, or a theologic, a way of making sense of these metaphysical notions that we're told structure the world but have contradictions in many instances. Theologic, or we could even say, well, theology is the practice of applying understood concepts about faith tradition to the modern world, and to whatever world they find themselves in, because there's a gap between the beginning of the tradition and the world in which we live. So sometimes I would say that theology is a way to close the gap. Um, I think Tillich might say that, and I think Tillich's theology of culture. I think Coleman's making a way out of no way. Um, is that I think Rivera's poetics of the flesh is that, well, how do we close the gap
Okay,
between
so
these?
so with theology, so you almost I think you allude to here like at least two different approaches. One is like an approach from first principles that feels like a top down approach, like abstraction of what a god must be like, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, all loving, or something like that. And these are all abstractions, and then you measure belief and practice against these abstractions, these ethical, spiritual abstractions or whatever. But you're alluding to another way of doing theology, and I wonder if that other way gets us into theopoetics. But that other way doesn't necessarily start from first principles, or does it?
That's right. Very exactly. The first one don't start from first principles. The first one, and this even goes back to what Whitehead says about God. Now, Whitehead wasn't a theologian, but he was very interested in philosophical ideas of God. And he has his own history of, growing up the son of an Anglican minister, and then him having an interest in philosophy. Then his son dies in war, and he throws all his theology books away. And then in doing, because he's also a mathematician, physicist, then he moves into philosophy in his later parts of his career. But he picks up this notion of God and his philosophy not as something, not as a religious in the sense of confessional use, but he picks it up in a philosophical sense. So to go back to what you just said about these notions of a different way of looking at theology, from a kind of building on abstract principles and trying to figure those out, to a more enfleshed way. This is the other perspective, which is actually a very theopoetic perspective. Many might call theopoetics as, well, paying attention to the containers that belief and systems of belief come in, or one may say, like I kind of say, theo, theopoetics is an imagination of what God can be, or what ideas of God can be based on the world we live in. So as opposed to saying, well, from essence comes existence. No, from existence come the ideas that we call deities. And this is both a process. Actually, this is kind of a process theopoetic way. And for Whitehead, this happens reciprocally. Well, as the world creates God, God creates the world. And which is very different from, as you mentioned, these top-down sorts of things. So where really the only creation is happening is from the top to the bottom, and you have to fall into that. If you don't, there's something wrong. But in process theopoetics, what's very important now, because not all theopoetics are process theopoetics, because some people would say, well, the process metaphysic is just too technical. So to talk about this whole notion of a free understanding of God in that way is not helpful. Catherine Keller gives a good battle rap a response to that when she says, well, I think the metaphysic is important. And for me, Keller won that round, and so did Roland Fabre, who who is at Claremont School of Theology. Catherine Keller is at Drew University. So yeah, this is process theopoetics. Really is about, well, how do God and the world create each other, and the containers in which that creation occurs are very important.
One way that I think about the distinction is how the two approaches deal with the question of, like, the theodicy, right? Where how do you count for the problem of evil in the world? And then if you have kind of theological theodicies, answers, responses, the most sophisticated ones I've seen go deep into trans world logic and shit like this, like heavily abstracted ways to somehow make sense of the existence of evil in the world. And that's a particular enterprise, a particular path that I've gone on. Like, okay, how do I account for this when people ask, or when I ask, even, these questions? But to approach it from a theopoetic perspective, to me, would seem to, instead of giving an answer of that sort, would to quite literally provide a poem in response. Not a syllogism, but a poem that's not going to answer your question in a deductive or inductive way, but it might prompt wonder, mystery, these other kind of states of mind. So it's an approach. So what role do you think like literal poetry might play, or like in theopoetics?
That's powerful. That's powerful, because see, that's where hip hop comes in for me, especially rap. Because of course, in my work, I am very particular about, well, saying I'm talking about the rap element of hip hop. But I think this poetry comes in because in rap we have literal poetry that reshapes the world. And and in terms of theodicy, you know, this is something that process philosophy and process theology has been known to provide an answer for. Will maybe not a satisfactory answer to some people, but an answer. because I mean, every answer is an answer. It may not satisfy everyone, but the process answer, as you mentioned, the omnis, well, if God is omnipotent, and if God is all present. Now, process thought many times affirms that the omnipresence of God, but many process thinkers like Hartsough and Griffin will reject omnipotence and omniscience. So, and the way that happens, and this is, and even, and the way it happens is kind of like this. In a process framework, now some people have debates about this, about what Whitehead meant when he said this, but in the beginning of process and reality, what some people call Whitehead's magnum opus. This was his Gifford lectures at the University of Edinburgh. He says in the beginning, well, the most ultimate thing in the universe is creativity. That's the most ultimate thing. And he said that God is an accident of creativity. So the way I look at that is, and people do this differently, as I say, but if you were to personify creativity, you'd have something like what many people think of as God. Now, to go to the back of the text, so this is at the beginning, to go to the back at the last part 5, he argues that God is the poet of the world. And what he says is and what he's getting at, because theopoetics really, poets is the Greek poets is just means creation. But you and I are talking about actual poetry right now. But Whitehead literally says, well, God is the poet of the world. Poets don't necessarily make words. They reassemble them. So for Whitehead, God is the idea of making poetry out of chaos. The universe itself may be chaotic, but the idea of God is that function which creates meaning out of it. So going back to hip hop, going back to rap, underground rap specifically, I see that happening. I see poets who I argue in my text are gods and goddesses. They're taking a world and they're reimagining it. They're not creating anything. Like Grandmaster Cass says, and I think I mentioned this in the text, hip hop didn't invent anything, but it reinvented everything.
Mm.
And so I think literal poetry, we can, I mean, you're ahead. We can go down the list of songs that have really reimagined what we think of as the world, but not really creating anything like ex nihilo, which process thought doesn't really deal with either. Because in Catherine Keller's book Face of the Deep, she talks about even how the Hebrew in Genesis has been read wrong, and that really there's no mention of ex nihilo in there. This is talking about, well, creating from the depths. What God created the world was from the depths. If we take the myth and run with it. Now, what some even say is literal, and that's fine too. But whatever role you take it as, or whatever way you take it, the text still argues for a creation out of the depths as opposed to creation out of nothing, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. That's dope. No, so because of process thought, it's not only that chairs are indistinguishable from the table next to it, are the surrounding, well, maybe let me back up. Just I want to be careful. Not process theology not only informs your view of supposedly discrete objects in the world like tables and chairs, but people. I suspect. I mean, we went to God, already, so
Yes.
that's like the ultimate maybe notion of personhood. But how does a Whiteheadian metaphysics cause you to look differently at the way people behave together? And how does that inform your notions of what counts as religion and what counts as hip hop?
hmm hmm Yeah. See, that's a good question. And I deal with it in a concept I call in the beginning of the text multi-racelessness. The people part of it, which ties into hip hop. But let's do multi-racelessness first. So kind of what I mean when I say that is that um, in a process framework, notions of race that we can trace back to beginning in the 15th century, the late 15th century, these labels that we call people, and that we become so wedded to, didn't always exist. And um and um Theodore Walker says it best, I think, in his book Mothership Connections, a neoclassical synthesis of black a neoclassical synthesis. I'm forgetting the other part of it, but look up Mothership Connections. Like, he actually named the book after George Clinton. So, but because he had a meeting with him, and he actually got backstage with him. Dr. Walker's a really cool dude. I met him. But anyway, but he makes this, and he's not the only one who says this, but he says, look, there was no black, white, Native American, Latino, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, Asian, etc. history before the Middle Passage, because these ideas were born from that time. Then if we go through the whole history of how race was developed through Blumenbach, through other thinkers, through the 15th century Limpia de Sangre, in which happened in Spain after um, the Christians took the Moors out of power. All these things kind of developed what we know as race. It didn't always exist. So
Okay,
what?
so sorry. That's the first move you're gonna make, right? Is you're gonna be like, are like common contemporary notions of ourselves as racialized or whatever, haven't always been here. So let's first acknowledge that, because you're going to say something about hip hop and race that is a move away from this kind of essentialist metaphysics that a lot of people seem to hold, that hip hop works a special kind of magic on, right? So
Right.
first you're saying historically, don't get it twisted. I was not always black. You were not always Chicano, whatever term you want to use, brown or whatever. So I just wanted to stop there and kind of say, boom, that's the first kind of step, right?
Correct. Correct. That's the first one, and which is just really a pointing back to history. Like, well, this is
Right.
well, we can. It's not hard. We weren't always what we've been told we were. That's the first,
Right.
and then the second step I use is well, how have the ways how have the ways in which we've been structured been oppressive? For in other words, because I distinguish, and other philosophers of race do as well, between race and ethnicity. Simply, race is what the system calls you for its own purposes. Ethnicities and culture is what you become through interpersonal relations with people around you and histories around you. Um, there is a difference between saying you're Yoruba and saying black. One is ethnicity and culture. The other is something the system called you. There's a difference in saying Mexicano, Beliceño, anything, and saying Latino. It's a difference. It's one is associated with a power structure and may have been used for liberation, but the other, in many instances, is something that it comes from nationality, it comes from histories, it comes from. So the second step is, well, can you have race without racism? Is race inherently racist? And so that's my second question, and then my third question, and then my third, I guess, sort of conclusion question is how does hip hop deal with that? And
Sure.
and are the ideas of hip hop and race like oil and water? Because if we look at the foundation of the culture of hip hop, there were several people who the system constructed very differently. But in the Bronx, they didn't understand themselves as different. They didn't. There were of course cultural differences, and there were of course ethnic differences, but those differences weren't divisive. You know, those differences in hip hop had a different play. And yeah, you know how KRS, you just brought it up, how KRS said, "I'm not black, I am hip hop." You know, and even Africa Bambaata's use of the word black in the early stages even plays with it, and I think makes a move beyond the notion of the categories of race when he bases, because some people didn't see people from Puerto Rico as being able to claim about Africa Bambaataa. He says, no, when I say black, that's what I mean. And then this of course is complex. This of course is made more complex because a lot of the history of the origin of hip hop is Caribbean, which in the way that these ideas shape themselves in the Caribbean doesn't map on to colonial notions of race. So my question is, well, in hip hop, does race does race function in that way, or does race function at all in some ways? And KRS even goes on to say, and I'll stop here. KRS even goes on to say that, well, hip hop is the only world culture that fulfills Dr. King's vision by seeing people not by how they look, but what their character is and what they contribute to the culture.
I just sensed not necessarily a tension, but maybe I'd be curious to see how this plays out. But I know Dr. Calvillo is doing some thinking around the ways, and there's actually some like, he pointed me to some research that's already been published around the way that hip hop in Los Angeles helped racialize Mexican Americans as brown as a identity category, and a new one even, and kind
Right.
of grounded that category or
Hmm.
that term. So of course, I think one consequence, of course, of any kind of cultural movement that's beyond more than five people, you're going to get a diversity of experiences. There's no singular way of looking at how hip
True.
hop functions on any
True.
population. So
True.
I can see, and you'll make an argument. I want you to read what you have here. That comes from your book and relates to what KRS said. But we see how hip hop functions in some ways to obscure these notions of race, and in other ways can maybe ground them. Let me
Hmm.
pull this text back up, and maybe you can. Can you see it? Can you read from that? Or
Yes. Yes. Okay. You want me to read what you highlighted?
yeah, if you could.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. What hip hop pioneer historian KRS-One, when hip hop pioneer clash historian KRS-One makes a statement, "I am not black, I am hip hop," he speaks of this process of creative transformation of identity, this relinquishing of the singular thing in exchange for the Deleuzian notion that the singular understanding of things does not exist, that takes place within underground hip hop as it preserves the original temporal accident of the culture. To say that your selfhood is hip hop is to assert that the self and the idea of identity that comes with it are nothing but but a continual event dictated by not only the chosen trajectory of the human actual entity, but also the context of other actual entities within which they be/come. Yeah. So in that, and to go back to Dr. Calvillo's point, I think he's right that hip hop in LA did begin to racialize the notion of brown. It did. I think that the the broader philosophical components of hip hop do challenge all of that. Even though it does come up, it does come up all the time. But then the question I would ask, and I kind of say, well, people live a different way. People live in a way that sort of betrays the category of race itself
Sure.
in
Okay.
hip hop. You know,
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah,
That's
I
interesting.
think that's really interesting to me. But I think Dr. Calvillo is very right in that. You know.
Yeah, that's dope. So okay, so we go from we you start to recognize that hip hop functions in a way that grounds identity, that obscures kind of these contingent categories in some
Yeah.
ways of race at least.
Yeah.
And you're saying, oh shit, like this is this a religion? And if it is, so how do you kind of construct an argument to say, yo, what's happening here has all the markers of religion? What are those markers?
I think that this is actually a good segue because we're dealing with because I think religion in many ways, at least in a sociological definition, is culture. So, what I see in the philosophy of hip hop is taking us back to the ethnicities and cultures we come from. You know, and not the races, the cultures that we and in those cultures, um, the contrast of those cultures, as Whitehead might say, makes what we know to be hip hop. Now, those nationalities from Chinese to Mexican to Guatemalan to Trinidadian to Jamaican, all of those ethnicities and cultures come together and are contrasted in such a way around these elements of the culture that many of these parts of the world created in some ways. So I think that culture as religion is a way in which hip hop brings us back and causes us to be able to step outside of racial notions, which I would argue are very different than ethnicity and nationality. Now, how is that religious? In in my definition of religion, and I think this is in my theopoetic definition of religion. Well, what is religious is how meaning, in Monica Miller's definition, is manufactured. How does a culture, which is composed of several cultures, make meaning? And how does it commemorate when meaning is made? And in many ways, meaning is made through creativity. The elements of hip hop um, become ways in which these cultural expressions that are very ancient are manifested in a modern sense. So there are life skills that we learn in the elements also that aren't just applicable to the elements themselves. I mean, think about how when Mr. Miyagi is showing Daniel, he's having him wash cars and paint fences, and Daniel like, this shit ain't karate. But he's like, no, it is karate. No, no,
Right.
everything you've learned here is a life skill. you know and these life skills are very are marks of culture, and they're marks of a large contrast to cultures. So in that sense, hip hop for me has the function of religion because it does that very work of, if we're going even back to, as I mentioned, Unbat's Men's that has his use of religare. Well, that's the most important parts of the society itself. And I think hip hop pushes us toward that. And in that way, I think it's religious, and also a mark of religion is devotion. People
Mm,
sometimes spend so much time on their craft, they forget about the real world. You know, I don't think that's any different than my mother praying for 4 hours,
mm.
you know, something similar. You know.
I so there's like a 2 or 3 step process my mind goes through, which is and I still have some holdover from my fundamentalist days here, so you have to forgive
Right.
me. But one is like,
No, it's
okay,
all good.
wow, underground religion is rap, bro. I'm convinced. But now the problem in my mind, at the first step, is like, oh shit. Now I gotta call rock religion. I gotta call soccer fandom religion. I gotta call Laker fan. There's religion is everywhere. Then I take my second step, which is the more enlightened step. Before it might have been, and that's bullshit. But now it's like, oh shit, religion really is everywhere. Like, you've refashioned the world to see to see God literally everywhere. Or if not everywhere, just about everywhere where there's culture or something like that.
That's right. I think I think that's the logical step that follows. It's like, yeah, well, anywhere where this is happening, religion is happening. And actually, it's funny you say that because my father was a soccer player. And my mom would say, "That's your dad's God," right? That's your father worships that soccer ball. She would say
All
that.
right.
It's a certain devotion. And
Sure.
and I think anywhere devotion shows up and anywhere meaning is made out of the world, I think that's religion. For me, you know, because it
Sure.
it really gets to and even this whole, and I was telling somebody, we were talking to somebody about this, I think yesterday, even this whole notion of religion being this realm that only deals with the abstract and things that that's a very recent notion, because that doesn't really begin until like, again, the 15th century
Right.
colonization. This whole separation is a way to say that, well, the traditions of our ancestors are somehow savage, and we're going to call these abstract ideas the religious, because as we know, voodoo, santeria, um, other systems of belief weren't even considered religion. They were considered something else. So even the whole use of the
Mm.
modern idea of the word religion was to separate individuals from culture. You know. So even and like Monica Miller and Christopher Driscoll say in their book Method is Identity, religion is race is religion, and that's very profound.
That's dope. So tell me about where you're teaching, what you're teaching. I hear you got a course on the philosophy of battle rap. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I'm currently at Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota. I am teaching. Yeah, I'm teaching philosophy there. And yeah, I teach everything from intro to philosophy, which my intro to philosophy class is some people are like, is this even philosophy? Because I have because I don't really in my intro I don't really have them read much of what people call the canon. I mean, they're reading everybody from Saul Williams to
Mm.
Catalina, Cisneros, a good friend of mine. They're listening to Armand Hammer. They're reading Judith Butler. They're listening to interviews, and for me, that's intro to philosophy, because these people are asking questions that are challenging what it means to live in the world and asking questions about existence. So I'm teaching that. I'm also teaching philosophy of religion there, but the philosophy of battle rap class is a pretty cool one. And I said, let me just try this. Let me just put these two together. And yeah, we for most of the term, and this may happen differently when I teach it next J term, but we went into a study of, first of all, the first week we were just studying what hip hop culture was, looking at the elements and looking
Mm.
at the history. Then the second we went into like different types of battling, and then the third week they read a text by a White Haitian and also a Delusian, Brian Masumi. He writes this text on process philosophy and what he calls activist arts. So
Mm.
they read that, and then they also did a rap battle. I divided the class into two groups, and each group had to pick one person to represent them in the battle. And
Mm.
the idea was, okay, well, as people who are justice minded and creative thinkers, we know that battling brings some challenges to us, because and I'll even say this, there was, there was a time when I would say things in battles I wouldn't really mean, but I would say them, and then I
Sure.
have to ask them, well, so why am I saying this stuff?
Sure.
So I still do that from time to time now, but there's certainly I don't say. My
Well,
thing is more about critiquing a person's rap style as opposed to critiquing them as a person. You know.
sure. Well, wait. What?
You
So,
know.
what role do you think? This is like probably an interesting religious parallel, but like humility, like self humiliation, like willing to endure humiliation in order to do what the fuck's going on there, bro?
Yeah, that's powerful because you have to, you have to stand and okay, whatever somebody says about you, you have to stand there and take it. Your only response is just a verbal one. You can't, and I think yeah, and see again, I think that even with that, because of course we know in the early stages of battling it wasn't even about that. Where it sorts of switches up is, and I even show my students this, is the Cool Mo D versus Busy Bee battle, where because but before that, rap battling was really about just outstyling somebody. But then
Right.
when Cool Mo D basically broke Busy Bee down to its very last compound, as KRS might say, then battling became this. And now Cool Mo D went in on his ass, and so then it became this whole physical, this whole personal attack type thing. But I think even with that though, the humiliation part is interesting because some people don't really see it as that. They see it as getting dunked on. Well, I just got dunked on. Okay, we don't necessarily see a dunk as a physical attack, but in a way it is. So yeah, so it's like, man, you just got insulted. I think many people who practice battle rapping, they think of it as that. Now that has some complexities because, of course, as I just said, there's some things that people say that can be very defaming to people and can be very, oppressive. Gender, sexual orientation, race, nationality. There's certain things that are said, disability. There's certain things that are said in battles that can be offensive on all of those levels. So my question to them was, okay, now we done seen all this shit, but as people who say that you're justice minded, how would you battle?
Sure.
So
Oh, bro.
so that was a challenge I had for them. You know.
Remind me to send you the link to my battle versus the Koch brothers. My MC diss to the Koch brothers. I got hired by this production company to produce this campaign against a astroturfing organization called Libre, who funded by the Koch brothers, who show up at churches saying, "Hey, we'll do your taxes for free, but by the way, the minimum wage, that's not good for us." You know what I'm saying? And so they're all peddling all these neoconservative policies out at churches under the guise of doing like free social service work or whatever. But anyways, the Koch brothers
Wow.
funded them. We're like, yo, let's call these fools out. So I got hired as a writer, but since I'm an MC at heart, it was basically me battling the Koch brothers with a piece that kind of sort of rhymed too. So at
Oh
any rate,
damn!
that's an
I do want
example
to
of
see that.
like taking shots at these motherfuckers with what we have in front of us, with the slingshots we have in front of us.
That's super. Could you post that on the novel adventure page? Because I think people like to see that.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'll do that for sure.
Okay.
Man, it was good. It was good to connect with you. I'm sure we'll stay connected and reconnect. Interested in
Thank you
your
so
work.
much, Brethren.
For sure, I want to big you up, big up the work you're doing, the thinking you're doing. This was I still remember when I was an undergrad and I thought I would try to write my senior project on something related to hip hop, and my advisor was like, no. And I was like, what do you mean? There was only like maybe a handful of books out at the time related to
Yeah.
hip hop.
Right.
Trisha Rose's book was probably the most prominent at the time still, and
Yeah.
I was like, oh no, I think this is gonna be cool. They're like, do something else, and I did something else.
Wow.
But all that to say, I've always thought that a serious look at hip hop and hip hop culture is fun and interesting and beneficial. So big ups to you and your crew who continue to do that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Big up, because that's you as well for this platform, man. It's really, really great. Keep doing what you're doing. We need it. We need it.
For sure, well, I appreciate that. And as you know, we do this to just because I like it, and also I sell coffee, and coffee helps fund some of this. And you can check out my coffee at mestizo.coffee. You can even use discount code hip hop for a discount. And I look to catch you up with not only you, John, but the folks out there who are watching next time around.